All right, let's go. The first war ever recorded. In the spring of 1881, a French archaeologist named Ernest de Salzec, serving as vice consul in the Ottoman port of Basra, traveled into the salt flats of southern Iraq and began digging into a low mound the local Bedouin called Tello. He was not looking for a war. He was looking for inscriptions, statues, anything that might prove the existence of the Sumerians, a civilization that, until that decade, most European scholars had dismissed as a linguistic fiction. The cuneiform tablets being recovered across Mesopotamia did not match any known language family. Some philologists insisted the tablets were Akkadian, written in a coded form. Others insisted they were the work of priests inventing a sacred dialect. The idea that an entire civilization older than Babylon, older than Egypt, older than every name in the Bible, could have existed and been forgotten was, to the academic establishment of 1881, a hypothesis bordering on the heretical. What de Salzec pulled out of the dirt over the next 19 seasons would rewrite the timeline of human history. Among the artifacts were the remains of a shattered limestone monument carved with figures in military formation, helmeted soldiers in tight phalanx, spears extended, marching across the bodies of the dead while vultures pulled the entrails from the corpses beneath their feet. The monument was approximately 4,500 years old. It depicted, in carved relief, a war. The Sumerians had written about that war as well. The cuneiform inscriptions across the surviving panels named the king, the enemy, the contested field, the gods who had ruled the verdict, and the casualties. This was not folklore. This was a press release. The conflict it described, fought between the cities of Lagash and Umma in approximately 2450 BCE, is the oldest war on Earth for which we possess a contemporary written account. Battles older than this had certainly happened. Massacres far older had certainly occurred. But this was the first time a human society had organized violence at scale, recorded that organization in language, and left behind a monument designed to ensure that the record would survive after the participants had died. The Stele of the Vultures, now reassembled in the Louvre from 7 recovered fragments, is the oldest war report in human history, and the story it tells is almost entirely a lie. To understand what happened between Lagash and Umma, you have to understand what southern Mesopotamia looked like in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was not a single empire. It was a patchwork of city-states, perhaps a dozen of them, each ruled by its own king, each worshipping its own patron god, each surrounded by irrigated fields that fed populations of tens of thousands. The cities competed. They traded, they intermarried, and they fought over water. Water was the foundation of everything. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically, sometimes not at all. The canal systems that diverted that water into the wheat and barley fields required constant maintenance and constant cooperation between neighbors, who had every reason to mistrust each other. Whoever controlled the canals controlled the harvest. Whoever controlled the harvest controlled the population, and whoever controlled the population controlled the kingdom. A blocked canal upstream could starve a city of 30,000 people in a single season. A breached levee could drown a year's crop in a single night. The technology of irrigation and the technology of warfare were, in early Mesopotamia, 2 expressions of the same problem. The border between Lagash and Umma ran along a strip of irrigated farmland called the Gedena, the edge of the plain. It was some of the most productive agricultural territory on Earth. Both cities claimed it. Both cities had claimed it for generations. And by 2450 BCE, the dispute over that single field had already produced at least 2 earlier wars stretching back over a century. The earlier kings had tried to settle the matter through arbitration. A king of the older city of Kish, neutral to both parties, had been called in around 2600 BCE to draw the boundary. His name was Mesalim. He had walked the line, planted boundary stones, and dug a ditch to mark the agreed-upon frontier. The settlement had held for a generation. Then the stones had been moved. Then the ditch had been filled in. Then the war had begun again. By the time Eannatum took the throne of Lagash, the Gedenna had been bleeding for 100 years. Eannatum was the son of a king named Akurgal and the grandson of a king named Ur-Nanshe, both of whom had ruled Lagash before him. He inherited a city of approximately 20,000 people, a temple complex dedicated to the war god Ningirsu, and a feud with the neighboring city of Umma that had outlasted 3 generations of his family. The inscriptions that survive from his reign describe him as the chosen of Ningirsu, the conqueror of foreign lands, the king who reached the sea. They list his victories with bureaucratic precision. He defeated Elam to the east. He defeated the city of Kish to the north. He defeated Mari, Akshak, and Uruk in succession. At the height of his reign, the kingdom of Lagash controlled territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. He was, by any reasonable measure, the first imperial conqueror in recorded history. And the war that defined him, the war he chose to carve into stone, was not the conquest of any of those distant cities. It was the recovery of a single contested field on his immediate northern border. What the inscriptions do not describe in detail is the actual mechanics of how he did it. What we have, instead, is the Stele. Carved from a slab of pale limestone, roughly 6 feet tall, the monument was originally erected on the contested border itself, planted in the soil as both a memorial and a warning. The surviving fragments depict the war in 2 registers. The upper register shows the human battle. The lower register shows the divine one. In the human register, Eannatum leads a phalanx of helmeted soldiers in tight formation. The men carry rectangular shields locked into a wall. They carry long spears thrust forward between the shields. They march in step over the bodies of the slain enemy, whose corpses are stacked in geometric piles beneath their feet. This is the oldest depiction of organized infantry tactics in human history. Greek historians would later credit the Spartans and the Macedonians with inventing the phalanx. The Spartans were 2,000 years late. The men of Lagash had been doing it before the pyramids of Giza were finished. The vultures in the upper corners of the composition give the monument its modern name. They are carved in profile, mid-flight, with severed human heads clutched in their talons and ropes of human intestine trailing from their beaks. This is not metaphor. This is reportage. The dead of Umma were left on the field. The vultures came. The carvers documented what the vultures did. 4,500 years later, the limestone still shows the scene exactly as the artist intended, a Sumerian farmer walking past the Stele to perceive it. The cost of breaking the boundary oath was not just defeat. The cost was being torn apart by birds in front of your own city. In the divine register, the god Ningirsu himself appears, gigantic, holding a net in which the enemies of Lagash are trapped. He raises a mace above the net and strikes the head of the man at its center, who is presumably the king of Umma. The implication is theological. The war was not won by Eannatum. The war was won by the god. Eannatum was merely the instrument. This framing matters because it preempts every possible counterclaim. To dispute the outcome of the war was to dispute the will of the god. To dispute the will of the god was to invite the next punishment. Above the figures, in dense columns of cuneiform, the inscription tells the story. The text begins with a divine oath. Mesilim, the earlier king of Kish, had originally surveyed the boundary at the command of Enlil, the chief god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The boundary stones had been planted with divine sanction. To move them was not merely a political offense. It was a religious crime. According to the Lagash version of events, the king of Umma, a man named Ush, had committed exactly that crime. He had ripped up the boundary stones. He had filled in the ditch. He had crossed into the Gedenna and seized the contested field. Eannatum, in response, had marched out at the command of Ningirsu, defeated the army of Umma in open battle, and forced the surviving leadership to swear a new oath. The oath was sworn on the names of 6 gods: Enlil of Nippur, the chief deity; Ninhursag, the mother of the gods; Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters; Sin, the moon; Utu, the sun; and Ninki, the consort of Enki. Each god served as a witness. Each god guaranteed that the violation, if repeated, would bring divine destruction down on the city of Umma and the head of its king. The inscription then lists the casualties. The number it gives is 3,600. These were the soldiers of Umma reportedly killed in the battle, their bodies piled into burial mounds visible from the border itself. The figure is suspicious. 3,600 is exactly 10 sars, the Sumerian unit of 360. It is the kind of number a propagandist would invent, a round and ritually satisfying total that signals divine completeness rather than statistical truth. The actual death toll may have been a fraction of this. It may have been higher. The truth was buried with the dead, and the dead were buried where the Stele could see them. What is not in dispute is the war's outcome. Lagash won. The Gedenna returned to Lagash control. The new boundary was marked, the new oath was sworn, and the Stele of the Vultures was raised on the field where the dead of Umma had fallen. For the first time in recorded history, a war had ended with a written treaty enforced by a written monument. The treaty did not hold. Approximately 23 years later, the king of Umma broke the oath. His name was Urlama. He led a fresh army across the boundary, smashed the new stones Eannatum had raised, and reignited the war that had supposedly been settled for all time. The fighting continued. The dead accumulated. The Gedenna changed hands at least 3 more times across the next century. A successor of Eannatum named Entamena defeated Ulama in a second war and erected his own commemorative inscription. A later king of Umma named Lugal-Zagi-Si finally broke the cycle by sacking Lagash itself, burning its temples, and ending the dynasty Ur-Nanshi had founded 6 generations earlier. Lugal-Zagi-Si then ruled briefly over a unified Sumer until he in turn was defeated by Sargon of Akkad, who absorbed every Sumerian city into the first true empire in human history. The dispute that had defined Lagash and Umma for 150 years became a footnote in the rise of a larger civilization. But the Stele remained. It stood in the dirt for centuries after Lagash itself had been abandoned, weathering in the sun, slowly broken by farmers and looters who reused its limestone for other purposes. By the time Ernest de Salzec arrived in 1881, only fragments of the monument were still buried at Tello. The figures had survived. The cuneiform had survived. The vultures, carved in the upper corners of the composition, pulling intestines from the mouths of the dead, had survived. What had not survived was the truth. The Stele of the Vultures records the version of the war that Lagash wanted future generations to remember. There is no equivalent monument from Umma. There is no surviving Umma account of what happened on the Gedenna. No Umma list of casualties, no Umma version of the oath. The losing city left no record because the winning city erased everything the losing city built. This is the founding principle of recorded history, and it begins here. Whoever survives writes the story. Whoever writes the story decides what the war was for. The first war humans ever wrote down was also the first war humans ever lied about. But here's where the standard narrative collapses. Lagash and Umma were not the first humans to fight a war. They were merely the first to write one down. The archaeological record contains evidence of organized human violence stretching back thousands of years before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed, and the patterns it preserves are darker than anything the Sumerian scribes ever inscribed in stone. In 1964, a Yale-led expedition working in the Nile Valley along the border of modern Sudan and Egypt began excavating a cemetery at a site called Jebel Sahaba. The graves contain the remains of 61 individuals, men, women, and children. The bones told a single story. Nearly half of the bodies showed evidence of violent death. Stone projectile points were embedded in skulls, lodged between vertebrae, buried in pelvic bones. Several individuals had been killed by multiple wounds in patterns that could not have been hunting accidents and could not have been one-on-one disputes. Children had been struck down alongside adults. The wounds had been delivered from multiple directions, suggesting attacks by groups of assailants rather than individual confrontations. Some skeletons carried more than 20 separate injuries. Some of the projectile points had been broken off inside the bone, indicating force sufficient to embed flint into a human spine. The cemetery was dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, more than 10,000 years before Eannatum was born. Recent reanalysis published in 2021 using updated radiocarbon techniques and high-resolution microscopy refined the dating and demonstrated that many of the victims had survived earlier attacks before being killed in later ones. The wounds were layered. The community had been attacked repeatedly across multiple generations until the final assault buried them in the cemetery, where they would be found 13 millennia later. Jebel Sahaba is now considered the oldest known evidence of sustained intergroup warfare in human history. The implications were difficult to absorb. The standard model of prehistoric human existence had described small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers living in relative peace, with violence limited to occasional interpersonal disputes rather than coordinated intergroup conflict. Jebel Sahaba demolished that model 13,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, in the climatic chaos of the Younger Dryas, when the Nile Valley was one of the few habitable corridors left in a drying North Africa. An entire community had been hunted down and killed by another community, and the survivors had buried them in a single cemetery that future archaeologists would not find for 13 millennia. Scarcity had armed them. Then scarcity had killed them. Jebel Sahaba was not isolated. In 2012, a research team led by Cambridge archaeologist Marta Mirazonlar was working along the shore of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya when they recovered the skeletal remains of 27 individuals at a site called Nataruk. The bones dated to approximately 10,000 years ago. The pattern of injuries was clinical in its consistency. A young woman in the late stages of pregnancy had been bound at the hands and feet and left to die. Her unborn child's skeleton was still inside her pelvis when archaeologists recovered her. Several of the adults had been killed by blunt force trauma to the skull, delivered with a wooden club or a stone weapon. Others had been killed by obsidian projectile points still lodged in the bone. The obsidian was significant. The nearest source of obsidian was over 100 miles away from the Nataruk site. The attackers had carried specialized weapons from a distance. They had come prepared. The victims included men, women, and children. The bodies had not been buried. They had been left where they fell. Nataruk is the earliest known example of a massacre committed by hunter-gatherers against another hunter-gatherer group. There was no agriculture in this region at the time. There were no cities. There were no kings. There was a small lakeside community of perhaps 30 people. And one morning, 10,000 years ago, another group of humans walked into their camp and killed them. Roughly 5,000 years later, on the other side of the world, the pattern repeated. In 1983, German archaeologists excavating a Neolithic site at Talheim in the Stuttgart region uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 34 individuals dated to approximately 5000 BCE. The skulls showed identical injuries, blunt force trauma to the left side of the head consistent with right-handed attackers wielding stone adzes. Men, women, and children had been struck down in sequence and dumped into a single pit. Several of the victims had additional arrow wounds to the back, suggesting they had been killed while trying to flee. The killers were not strangers. Isotope analysis of the bones revealed that the Talheim victims belonged to a recognizable linear pottery culture community. So did the weapons. so did the burial practices. The killers and the killed had come from the same broader cultural world. This was not invasion. This was civil war between Neolithic neighbors over what was almost certainly land, water, or stored grain. The same pattern would surface again at Schöningen, at Aspern-Schletz, at Herxheim, at site after site across Central Europe in the centuries following the arrival of agriculture. The Neolithic was not a peaceful pastoral idyll. The Neolithic was a slow-motion war over who got to keep the harvest. What these prehistoric massacres demonstrate is that organized human violence is not a Sumerian invention. It is not a Bronze Age development. It is not a side effect of agriculture or civilization or kingship. It is older than all of them. The capacity to march into another community and kill every member of it, including the pregnant women and the infants, was already part of the human behavioral repertoire 10,000 years before anyone built a city. What Sumer added was not the violence. What Sumer added was the record. This is the threshold that the Stele of the Vultures represents. Before Lagash and Umma, wars had been fought and forgotten. The dead at Jebel Sahaba lay unnamed in the Nile sand. The dead at Nataruk lay unnamed on the shore of Lake Turkana. The dead at Talheim lay unnamed in a German pit. No survivor of any of those massacres had access to a writing system that could preserve the name of the enemy, the cause of the conflict, the number of the slain, or the justification offered by the victors. Their wars existed in human memory for 1 or 2 generations and then dissolved. Eannatum changed that, not by inventing war. By inventing the war monument, after the Stele of the Vultures, every subsequent civilization understood that organized violence could be transformed into political memory. The Egyptians carved the victory of Ramesses II at Kadesh into the walls of their temples, omitting the inconvenient detail that the battle had ended in a draw. The Assyrians lined their palace corridors with reliefs depicting the empalement of prisoners and the sacking of cities, designed to terrify visiting diplomats into preemptive submission. The Persians inscribed the conquests of Darius into the cliff face at Behistun in 3 languages, so that no traveler in any direction could miss the message. The Romans erected triumphal arches across half the known world. The Maya recorded the capture of rival kings on stele that ringed the plazas of their cities. The Chinese chronicled the rise and fall of dynasties in official histories that always served the dynasty currently writing them. Every one of these monuments owes its conceptual existence to a single shattered limestone slab pulled out of the Iraqi desert by a French diplomat in 1881. The war between Lagash and Umma was not historically important because of who won. It was historically important because the winner decided to write it down. What makes the Stele of the Vultures particularly unsettling is what it reveals about the technology of history itself. Recorded history begins with a war that had been lied about for the benefit of the side that wrote the record. Everything that follows in the written archive of human civilization sits on top of this foundation. The kings who carved their victories into stone were not historians. They were propagandists working in the medium that we now call history. For thousands of years, our understanding of the past has been built from documents produced almost exclusively by the winners. The losers, when they appear at all, appear through the eyes of the people who killed them. Whole civilizations have been remembered only through the contempt of their conquerors. The Akkadians who absorbed Sumer wrote dismissively of the Sumerians they replaced. The Assyrians who conquered the Babylonians wrote dismissively of the Babylonians they replaced. The Romans who destroyed Carthage wrote so completely about the people they had destroyed that the Carthaginian voice is now almost impossible to recover at all. 3 Punic wars across more than a century, ending in the systematic demolition of one of the great trading civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean. And the survivors who could have told us what Carthage believed about its own gods, its own laws, its own meaning were either dead or enslaved within a generation. The bones at Jebel Sahaba are silent. The bones at Nataruk are silent. The bones at Talheim are silent. The dead of Umma, buried in their geometric piles beneath the feet of Eannatum's phalanx, are silent. The only voices that survived from the world of the first recorded war are the voices that won. If you are reading the history of any war that ended before living memory, you are almost certainly reading a version of events that someone with a political reason to lie chose to leave behind. The dead do not contradict the inscriptions. The defeated do not file objections. The losers, when they are mentioned at all, are mentioned only to demonstrate why they deserve to lose. This is the inheritance Sumer gave us. Not war itself. War was already old. What Sumer gave us was the ability to convert violence into a story, and the ability to ensure that the story would outlast the people it was about. The Stele of the Vultures stands today in a glass case in the Louvre, in Paris. 7 fragments, reassembled, mounted upright in the position they would have occupied on the Ghedana border 45 centuries ago. The carved figures are still recognizable. The cuneiform is still legible. The vultures in the upper corners still pull the intestines from the mouths of the dead. The field they were planted on is gone. The canal system Lagash and Umma fought over has long since silted into the desert. The city of Lagash is a low mound of bricks, visible only from satellite imagery, ringed by the modern Iraqi province of Kar, surrounded by oil infrastructure and military checkpoints. The city of Umma is a stretch of dirt 20 miles to the north, undistinguished from the surrounding plain, looted repeatedly across the 20th and 21st centuries for whatever tablets could still be extracted from its ruins. The god Ningirsu, in whose name the war was fought and won, has not been worshipped by a living person in over 3,000 years. What remains is the monument, and the monument tells us, in the oldest written voice we possess, that the king of Lagash was righteous, that the king of Umma was a treaty breaker, that the war was just, and that the gods themselves intervened to ensure the correct outcome. None of this can now be verified. The only people who could have contradicted the inscription have been dead for 45 centuries. Their version of events was never recorded. It will never be recovered. The truth of the first war ever written down ended with the people who lost it. We are the descendants of every recorded war that has happened since. We are the descendants of the people who won them. The people who lost did not pass down their genes in equivalent numbers. They did not pass down their languages. They did not pass down their gods. We carry in our bodies and in our cultures the consequences of 45 centuries of recorded violence, the cumulative weight of every war that ended with a stele raised over the bodies of the people who could no longer object. The stele of the vultures was the first. It was not the last. It established the template, and the template has never stopped working. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.